On the Buzz Meter this Sunday, anger management. The press accuses the president of fueling rage to rile up his Republican base. But some liberal pundits are pushing a mad-as-hell strategy to fire up their side. And the media debate Republican charges that today's protesters are part of a mob.
And you don't give power to an angry left-wing mob, and that's what the Democrats have become.
What they are running on is that they are the last line of defense against you, the angry mob, otherwise known as the majority of the country that disagrees with Republicans. Wow.
So the angry left-wing mobs you thought you had been watching on television turn out to be merely a hallucination. They're a fever dream concocted by those diabolical magicians over at Fox News.
So this idea that this was this crazy, out-of-control mob that was frightening everybody, I think is just a storyline that works really well for Republicans.
I think what we've seen from the left is pure dysfunction, pure chaos, a party that is willing to do absolutely anything, even destroy an innocent man.
Is there a media double standard when it comes to the politics of anger? Nikki Haley stuns the Beltway press corps by abruptly resigning, leading to all kinds of chatter about why she's leaving the UN job and why now. Has the speculation gone overboard? The apparent murder of a Saudi columnist sparks media criticism of President Trump for not acting more aggressively toward the kingdom, with some even blaming the president's rhetoric. How is that fair? Melania Trump, in a rare interview, pressed about sexual assault and her marriage on ABC.
Do you think men in the news that have been accused of sexual assault and sexual harassment have been treated unfairly?
You need to have a really hard evidence that, that if you're accused of something, show the evidence.
Plus, is Kanye West's wild and crazy Oval Office visit causing some pundits to become unhinged? I'm Howard Kurtz, and this is Media Buzz. The major newspapers have been filled with stories about President Trump using the brutal Brett Kavanaugh confirmation to make his conservative supporters angry. But their op-ed pages are preaching a rather different message. Take a look. Charles Blow, New York Times, liberals, this is war. David Leonhardt, New York Times, get angry and get involved. His lead, if you're not angry yet, you should be. E.J. Dionne, Washington Post, we need to stay angry on Kavanaugh. So aren't there two sides to the use of anger and fear in the midterms? Joining us now to analyze the coverage, Molly Hemingway, senior editor at The Federalist and a Fox News contributor. Jillian Turner, a Fox News correspondent and former White House national security official. And Richard Fowler, talk radio host and also a Fox News contributor. Molly, it's been a major media theme. President whipping up his base over Kavanaugh to get Republican voters to turn out. Well, these liberal columnists are openly, these are not dog whistles, openly doing the same thing on the left.
Right, and we may wish that people weren't motivated to vote by anger, but anger is a very common way for people to decide who to vote for. I think what we saw with the Kavanaugh coverage was a lot of coverage of these people screaming at senators, trying to tear down the walls of the Supreme Court, Antifa protesters in various coasts, and that was all shown as a way that the media thought was conveying that people were really upset about Kavanaugh. What it actually showed people was what in their mind was a lot of scary mobs, and that made them very concerned. They like to see rule of law, order. They felt like rule of law had been overthrown in the Kavanaugh discussion anyway, and so it really confirmed for them a lot of their fears. So it was weird that the media showed all of these things when they thought it was sort of helping the anti-Kavanaugh case, and then when it turned out that people actually hated what they were seeing, they said, oh, it's crazy to call these people mobs, or it's crazy to say that you need to fight against that. Well, that doesn't make sense.
Well, I'll come back to the mob question, but let me ask you first, Jillian. The politics of anger and fear and campaigns have basically been around forever in the history of the country, but shouldn't the press report and or call out both sides equally if it's happening on the left as well as the right?
Yeah, of course they should. That's part of the responsibility. I'd actually go one step further than Molly on this, and I would say that riling up people is actually the only way to get Americans to vote, particularly in midterms. And so for most of
a lot of people stay home.
Yeah, the turnout is horrendous, right? So this is the moment to, get people angry. This is the moment. I think this is the mainstream media, most of which is left-leaning, doing their part to get out the vote in the midterms. It's almost like they've got their own electoral strategy going a couple of weeks out.
Richard, what do you think, for example, of E.J. Dionne, an old colleague of mine, widely respected political columnist, saying this was a judicial coup, putting Kavanaugh on the high court, and saying that we should pack the Supreme Court when the Democrats win, and Charles Blow saying it's a war and the other side is trying to preserve white male power? Those are
Well, this media coverage is very reminiscent to the media coverage we saw around quote-unquote mobs in 2010, where you saw during the healthcare town halls, where you would see the media go to these healthcare town halls and be like, look at the conservatives, they're so angry, right? And sort of stoking this healthcare town hall. And sometimes they were angry, sometimes they weren't. But as soon as the cameras show up, people tend to get a little bit angrier. And I think in what we saw from history there is that it ended up flipping the House in the opposite direction. So maybe Jillian is right, and maybe the media, possibly, yeah, and maybe the media is playing a hand here. But either way, I think what we can all agree in is that our country has become more and more tribalistic. And meanwhile, back at home, I think the American people aren't looking for relatability, they're looking for representation.
So that's why we're hearing words like coup and white male power and all that. Now, so I happen to think that the protesters screaming and disrupting at the Kavanaugh committee hearings, and even things like chasing Ted Cruz and other Republicans out of restaurants, I mean, maybe a relative handful of people, has hurt the liberal cause. So I agree with you on that. But the media really don't like President Trump and his allies calling them a mob.
Yeah, there was a lot of pushback against calling this unruly protest group a mob, but that's basically what the definition is. And I would point out that in 2000...
I mean, even if it's 5 people or 10 people or 20 people?
Well, a large crowd of people, especially one that is disorderly and intent on causing trouble or violence.
You looked it up.
I think when you're trying to tear down the walls of the Supreme Court or tear down the doors, that would qualify as that. When you're redirecting traffic, taking over a city of Portland as Antifa, that qualifies. And I would also point out that people do remember that in 2010, quite large groups of people were called mobs, and it really frustrated them. You never saw Tea Partiers going to people's houses and places where they were eating and getting them kicked out of restaurants. This type of behavior does alarm people, and reasonably so.
Now look, everyone has the right to protest, but you rarely see liberal commentators, or Democrats for that matter, calling out activists for disruptive tactics, for tactics that maybe go too far, which kind of does that leave an opening for the president and his allies to say mob and you should be scared and all of that.
Well, here's the thing. I think the First Amendment in our country, which is the First Amendment, which is interesting that the founders made it the first one, is that it allows us the ability to protest. And sometimes protesting is ugly, whether you like it or not. And in history, even in the ugliness of protest is what made our country so great and so moved legislation forward. Where I disagree with Molly is, in 2010, some of those protests got pretty ugly. I remember being at a healthcare town hall in Fairfax, Virginia, where Congressman Jim Moran had to be escorted out by Fairfax County Police because they were afraid that he was going to be harmed. So in either case, what we have realized is that our politics does get us angry. These issues get us angry, and we have to have real conversations about them.
Since we're talking about the historical comparison, is there a media double standard?
Absolutely. It seems every time a group of conservatives get together, they're called like violent right-wing mobs, and then you get this defensive people on the right, or on the left. And I would point out also that in the last couple of years, we had a large-scale assassination attempt against Republican members of Congress, which many people in the media act like was not a big deal. I think a lot of Americans are worried about that type of violence and inciting that type of violence.
Right, but there was a CNN commentator who tried to conflate that attempt on Steve Scalise and the others at that baseball game with the protests, however disruptive they may be. I think it's very clearly in a different category. But the anger narrative, Jillian, got kicked off when President Trump, and it's only this past Monday, seems like 3 months ago, right after Brett Kavanaugh was sworn in that ceremony at the White House, he apologized to the justice and his family, and then he called the sexual assault allegations fabrications that were part of a Democratic hoax. And that's very different than the way the president had talked about it while Christine Blasey Ford was testifying and while the Senate was still debating. And I think that drew a lot of media flack as well.
It did, and it also directly contradicted the line that Republicans had crafted so carefully over the preceding week, which, as far as I can tell, seemed to be, we believe the victim, in this case Christine Blasey Ford, we believe she was sexually assaulted, but we don't necessarily know that it was by Brett Kavanaugh. That was like the gold standard for Republicans going into the final days of this. And that does, the president going out in the other direction and then saying, basically she lied, what did really undercut that message? And I think the media was very quick to pick up on that. Any disagreement between President Trump and the rest of the Republicans on the Hill or wherever they are is something that instantly grabs everybody's attention. I have to just say, because I spent 2 days embedded with Kavanaugh protesters on both sides of this, on the Hill and at the Supreme Court, a lot of those people felt undercut by that message. A lot of people, a lot of women who I spoke to on both sides, conservatives who supported Brett Kavanaugh and liberals, women who you know were there to protest against him, really felt that that line at its core is something that set women back by 100
fabrication
years.
and hoax.
I think it's worth remembering that there was never any evidence supplied to support any of the allegations, and that the allegations included the claim that Brett Kavanaugh was the ringleader of a secret gang rape cartel when he was in high school. I think it's okay to call these types of things fabrications or hoaxes.
Right. That was the so-called third accuser, was Julie Swetnick. I didn't think that should have been publicized at all because there was less than zero evidence.
But in fact, there was never any evidence to support any of the claims. There was never any corroborating evidence.
Despite the media criticism of the president saying that Christine Blasey Ford participated in a hoax?
Well, I don't know if he was saying that was about Christine Blasey Ford.
He wasn't specifically saying, but there are implications.
I think that there should have been a lot more media coverage of just how exactly these allegations came out, how they never had any support, how the Democratic Party played around with them, how they were read into the record, including that gang rape allegation, which Dianne Feinstein, began the hearings with. This is something weird, and I think that it would be better to have more coverage of how weird it was, what was going on, and how these allegations were whipped up, rather than parsing his language.
I think the media got this one right, and anytime the president sort of separates himself from his party, I think it's important that the media covers it and they analyze it, and here's why. The president is the head of the Republican Party. He leads this party, especially 24 days out from this midterm. When he separates himself from what's happening on Capitol Hill, that is newsworthy because how can members of Congress who are on the ballot running?
So you think the media criticism of words like hoax and fabrication was justified?
Absolutely, because on Capitol Hill they're saying something completely different, as Jillian just said. And so you have the supporters, you have members of Congress who are on the ballot saying she's credible, but we don't necessarily think that it was Brett Kavanaugh, and the president saying, oh, she made it all up. That means the party and him are unaligned.
Let me move on to something that drew a lot of media criticism, and that was with Hurricane Michael devastating Florida that night. The president held a rally. Here are some of the pundits taking shots at POTUS.
Here we have a president holding just a full-on pep rally while Americans are suffering and dying in Northwest Florida.
Look, just from a pure level of optics, he chose to take a warm base bath while the people of Florida were getting slammed in the face with 150-hour winds.
Right. The optics weren't great, but did it deserve this level of media condemnation?
I don't know. I think it is interesting when a president doesn't stay at home when a major issue is happening. President Obama got a lot of criticism for doing a fundraiser when the Benghazi terror attack was happening. I'd be kind of curious to see if everybody switched sides on whether this was an example of where the president
If this had been Obama holding a rally during a major hurricane, the conservatives at Fox and elsewhere would have gone.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think it's very important to remember, that this was millions of people out of power in multiple states, and I think it's the job of the commander-in-chief to remember, like, he should have been I would love to see him in a command center. I would like to see him at FEMA, trying to work with the governors. Instead, he was at a rally talking to his supporters.
Well, in fairness, he did begin his remarks at the rally by talking about the hurricane in Florida, but it sure became a big issue. When we come back, the president who built a political career attacking the press, now talking to the reporters a lot, virtually every day. And later, his wife in a major network interview and fielding some sensitive questions about their marriage. It's no accident as the midterm campaign ramps up, President Trump has shifted strategy, talking to journalists at length just about every day, ranging from photo ops and Oval Office sessions to a sit-down with New York Magazine to appearances on Fox News and 60 Minutes.
What's your response to Hillary Clinton saying last night's swearing in of Judge Kavanaugh was more a political event than it was a national event?
I guess that's why she lost. She doesn't get it. She never did.
You're on air right now, Mr. President, so
Good,
let's get to it.
Good. With you,
okay.
I like being on air with your beautiful
well,
ratings.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Well, he's very talented, but no, I haven't.
You know, the rumor is the day after the midterms, you're going to fire him and you're going to fire the Attorney General.
Well, I actually get along well with Rod.
We keep hearing that the White House is in chaos.
It's wrong. It's so false. It's fake news.
Molly, taking so many questions in so many formats, after a lot of media criticism that, the president doesn't have enough formal press conferences.
Well, it is funny. He didn't do a lot of these interviews with major media for a very long time, and now he is doing them. And I think it's very interesting about what it says about how he's feeling about his presidency. Partly this is about getting out the vote in November, but I think it also is speaking to what he understands is a very a period of strength for him. The economy is humming along. The Russia hoax, I think most people realize, or the Russia situation, I think most people think of it as a hoax or something that isn't actually real. Foreign policy
successes. It's kind of on hold right now because of the campaign season, the Mueller probe.
Right. And
publicly at least.
And also this blue tsunami that everyone was expecting of major Democratic gains in the Senate and the House is a much more complicated story. I think most people think that Republicans will keep the Senate, and now it's getting more even about what's going to happen in the House as well. So he feels strong, and he's going out on air to say it.
Well, White House insiders tell me that this is not some strategy cookbook by advisors, that it's all him. The president wants to be out there. He thinks he's his best spokesman, and certainly the midterms are a factor. And he obviously enjoys, for all his criticism, the fencing with reporters. Maybe there's so much Trump in our lives that we lose sight of the fact that this is very unusual for a president to take this many questions, so many forums. Does it contrast, Jillian, with his more belligerent approach of failing New York Times, dishonest media, fake news, and all that?
It definitely contrasts when he's taking interviews with outlets like CBS, ABC. These are not his favored news networks. These are part of the folks that he feels are sort of conspiring against him. So that is notable. What I will say as a reporter is it's wonderful when he does this. I spent Friday reporting live from the White House, and it has this wonderful trickle-down effect. When the president gets chatty and talkative and opens up to reporters, everybody else does too at the White House. So you get senior down to junior officials more willing to kind of grab your ear and tell you a juicy news nugget. You get Larry Kudlow, willing to gaggle impromptu for 20 minutes on the north lawn of the White House. I think these are things that kind of come from the top. I don't think the president's giving people direction to open it up and talk to the media more, but they're sort of following his example there.
And he's making news on multiple subjects each day. Now, there's been a lot of media chatter about Fox News no longer carrying most of the president's evening rallies, at least in full, because the ratings are down below what Fox could get from its regular primetime hosts. Do you think that's significant?
Well, I think these freewheeling rallies they've helped him because they've been televised, but I think the American people are tired of that, and I think these interviews help him. And I think the president, as a master brander and marketer, he understands the story the media is not covering is the fact that while, yes, the House and the Senate are a little bit more complicated, when it comes to governor's mansions, Republicans could take major losses this November, and the president gets that, and these interviews could help shore up his base and make sure that he protects some of these governor's mansions.
Right. Well, now that the rallies are almost every night, there's a lot of repetition, so they're a little less newsworthy, and this is a business, and business of ratings. There's been some grumbling about, well, Sarah Sanders is holding fewer briefings, but what she has told me and others is, well, who'd you rather hear from, me or the leader of the free world?
I wish there were just many more press conferences with the president, because I find those to be utterly delightful to watch. But I think the issue of these campaign rallies really is a tricky one. There's news value whenever the president speaks. There's much less news value when it's a campaign event, and particularly with normal politicians. It's a little tricky with Trump because you never know what he's going to say.
Right.
He might break
he's
news
entertaining
at any
and he's
moment.
unpredictable.
And also, I think people don't want to see Fox following the lead of their competitors. They want to see difference in how they cover things. And so I think there's some frustration from people who do, if they can't get it on Fox, where are they going to get it if they are interested in this news?
Right. Well, it's not like the rallies aren't being covered, but they're not being covered wall to wall.
Right.
And if he makes news, obviously everybody covers them. Richard Fowler, Molly Hemingway, great to see you this Sunday. Jillian, we'll see you a little later. I had Jedediah Bila on how too much tech is kind of ruining our lives, but up next, the press is blindsided by the Nikki Haley resignation and responds with an avalanche of speculation. Reporters here in Washington expect everything to leak, absolutely everything, especially when top officials are leaving the Trump administration. So it was rather amusing to watch the scramble when word seeped out that Nikki Haley was quitting as UN ambassador, and the feverish speculation. Why? Why now? And why didn't we know about it?
This breaking news coming as a shock to many, from New York to Washington and beyond. Shockwaves through the foreign policy establishment.
4 weeks before the midterms, the ambassador to the United Nations suddenly resigning.
When we first got wind of this, and it was only this morning that Nikki Haley informed her staff of it, we were all going, whoa, what's going on here? What's this all about?
The timing is odd. Big two-year departures are traditionally announced just after the midterm elections, not 4 weeks before.
There was some chatter even at one point about perhaps Ivanka Trump taking that role if Nikki Haley ever left.
Right. Oh, and there was one other journalist who was asked to weigh in on Fox. But I've got to tell you, my spidey sense tells me there is more to the story. I guess I outed myself as a lifelong Spider-Man fan. When I was a kid, I had a letter published in an early issue. Look, While President Trump says he knew in advance, despite all the chatter, there were legitimate journalistic questions about the timing, even after the president and his ambassador were all smiles in the Oval Office. Why the rush to announce this, taking most White House and State Department officials by surprise the morning after the Kavanaugh swearing in and a month before the midterms, when Haley is staying till the end of the year anyway. But the instant speculation about Haley's political future, her successor, various conspiracy theories, well, let's just say there was a lot of airtime to fill. Hope Hicks, the Donald Trump loyalist who resigned last spring as White House communications director, has found a new job. It's with Fox. The Murdoch family has hired her as the chief communications officer for the company that will emerge after Disney buys the entertainment assets of 21st Century Fox in that $71 billion deal. While there was some predictable criticism about the ties between the president and his favorite network, Hope Hicks will be working on the corporate side, based in L.A., not directly for Fox News. Coming up, some pundits attacking Kanye West for his X-rated rant in the Oval Office, but is the real problem that he likes this president? Plus, a network reporter presses Melania on sexual harassment allegations against her husband. Kanye West's rambling and profanity-laced visit to the Oval Office was pretty strange, but perhaps not as strange as the overheated media reaction.
It was something about when I put this hat on, it made me feel like Superman. You made a Superman. That's my favorite superhero. Trump is on his hero's journey right now, and he might not have expected to have a crazy mother like Kanye West run up and support.
He's all of a sudden now the model spokesperson. He's the token Negro of the Trump administration. This is ridiculous.
And now all of a sudden he is the person who represents the African American community. He doesn't. This was an embarrassment. Kanye's mother is rolling over in her grave.
Joining us now from New York, Jedediah Bila, a former co-host of The View and author of the new book, Do Not Disturb, How I Ghosted My Cell Phone to Take Back My Life. And Jessica Tarloff, senior editor at Bustle and a Fox News contributor. Jedediah, I didn't like Kanye dropping the mother word in the Oval Office, and the ranting was kind of disjointed at times, but the media really whacking this guy. MSNBC's Stephanie Rule calling his visit an assault on our White House. What do you make of that?
Yeah, nothing like a good media meltdown. It's unbelievable, honestly. I mean, the way that they reacted. This is a guy who, if he had done the same exact thing, and he had done it in the Oval Office and President Obama had been sitting there, they would have been talking about how he was bringing front and center some great issues like stop and frisk, how he was talking about prison reform. It's really been fascinating to watch, whether you like Kanye or not. This man there's been a character assassination against this guy. I mean, they have called him everything from a traitor to an idiot to someone who's deeply, deeply disturbed, who needs help. They've infantilized him. And you don't have to agree with everything he says, but you do have to defend his right to say it. And he, just like every other celebrity that has walked into that White House from a former administration, has a right to if he has a platform, to make his voice heard. And there's no reason why he should be described as all of those horrible things. Right. No one who walked into that White House and was a celebrity during the Obama years was a policy wonk, I can tell you that. All right, let me get Jessica in. So I think some of the harshest comments have come from African-American commentators who maybe view Kanye as betraying the cause. I mean, when CNN contributor Tara Setmeyer calls him a token Negro, and Don Lemon drags his late mother into it, I thought that went a bit far.
I certainly think dragging his late mother into it is going too far. As for what the African-American community feels about this, as a white person, I certainly can't comment on that, but I do understand and sympathize with their frustration when Kanye West uses his important platform to advocate for things like abolishing the 13th Amendment, when he has shown total lack of understanding about the Jim Crow South, for instance. That's something John Legend has spoken out about. Fellow rapper T.I. has come out and said that he's embarrassed to know him because of what he's doing in terms of setting back the black community by going in there and sort of playing nice, as it were, with a president who they feel does not advocate for African Americans in this country or do anything to benefit them. To Jedediah's point about if Kanye had gone into the White House with President Obama famously called him a jack expletive. So I don't think that really would have been going on there. And I think there is also a great deal of hypocrisy to all of this, because conservatives never get celebrities that support them, but they rail on liberals when a celebrity gets involved. We all remember Shut Up and Dribble, for instance, the mocking of Jay-Z and Beyonce. So I don't think that it's really fair for them to be coming after the coverage of, yes?
Let me get you both in on this, Jedediah, first. So it is true that, there's some on the right who criticize Jay-Z and Ludacris and other rappers who visited Barack Obama in the White House. But some liberals think it's an outrage that Kanye likes Trump, because when Kanye West said George Bush doesn't care about black people after Hurricane Katrina, he was sort of lauded in the media. Jedediah first.
To be clear, what conservatives criticize oftentimes is the collectivism of Hollywood. So it's predictable. Hollywood and the Democratic Party are often go hand in hand. They support each other. They back each other up. It's not a personal attack criticism generally of this person's mentally unstable. I can tell you I've sat on panels with a bunch of liberal celebrities who feel it's their job. You look at what Alyssa Milano is doing, for example, to be political activists at that time. They don't take nearly as much heat. The bottom line is Kanye does not fit in ideologically with the rest of Hollywood and with most of the media right now. And they have to take him out, because here's a guy who does have a platform, who is in there talking about issues with President Trump, and who actually may make an impact in a way that most of the media and most of Hollywood doesn't like. So now they have to ruin his character, or at least try to. And that's what's happening. It's really scary.
Jessica, brief comment.
I agree largely with what Jedediah is saying here, and I do think that Kanye West, just as his wife did, using President Trump as a way to get criminal justice reform is a wonderful thing that we should all be lauding.
All right, well,
but he said a lot of other things that were certainly not. You just want to end because we agree, because I got more disagreement.
I'm going to move. Okay, yeah, all right. But let me get to Melania Trump, who did this rare sit-down, lengthy interview with ABC News, and one of the questions was whether Donald Trump's alleged infidelities has put a strain on her marriage. Let's watch.
I know people like to speculate, and media like to speculate about our marriage and circulate the gossip. But I understand the gossip sells newspapers, magazines, getting advertisers. And unfortunately, we live in this kind of world today.
Have you been hurt, though?
Media what is speculating. Yeah, it's not always pleasant, of course.
Jessica, was it fair for ABC's Tanya Owens to ask about that, and how do you think the First Lady handled those questions?
I think it was fair to ask about it, and I think that she handled it quite well. If we think about the number of times that Hillary Clinton has been faced with Bill Clinton's infidelity and alleged accusations of sexual assault, I don't even know if we can count that high. She had to sit in a debate and face an audience with Juanita Broaddrick and Paula Jones sitting there right in front of her face. So I think it's totally fair game, especially since there was an accusation that President Trump used campaign funds to pay off a woman that he allegedly had an affair with. But I think that she handled it well, and she's at 54% popularity, by far the most popular Trump out there.
Jedediah, when Melania Trump says the press is reporting gossip, she has a point, but there was the Stormy Daniels lawsuit and Donald Trump reimbursing Michael Cohen for the payment to Stormy Daniels, and payments talked about on a tape to Karen McDougal, so it's not all just made-up gossip.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a desperation there to try to get her to say something anti-Trump against her husband. I think those were all fair questions. Those things did happen. But questions like, do you love your husband? I mean, I was sitting at home watching saying, really? I mean, I think they really wanted, and not just on that issue, but on several policy issues, I saw that they would kind of parallel Trump's policy on something, whether it was immigration or whatnot, and some activism or some opinion that Melania has expressed to try to really get her to say what my husband is doing is wrong. Obviously, they want that soundbite. That would be great for them. I thought she did a great job. I thought she was measured, and she did not give them the soundbite that they wanted. That was pretty clear to me.
Yeah, for somebody who doesn't do a lot of interviews, and I wish she would do more.
She gave a few soundbites, though, I gotta say, with I'm the most bullied woman in the world, and that she was wearing that jacket.
Which I would agree with, by the way.
All right. She said she was
we can
bullied.
compare notes about bullied people after the show.
All right.
And the jacket saying that she was.
Well, the jacket, I wanted to close by saying she wore that jacket. I don't care, do you? And at the time, her office said, no message there, but she said the message was she doesn't care what the left-wing media say.
That's her
quote. All right. Jessica Tarloff, great to see you. Jedediah, stick around for the next segment. And next on MediaBuzz, Jedediah on being savaged on Twitter and how social media may be just ruining our lives. And later, one media outlet attacking a top White House official for his behavior when he was 8 years old. I'm serious. Virtually everyone in the media has sadly grown accustomed to Twitter hate, but look at some of those aimed at Jedediah Bila. ABC, please boot these lame-ass chick from the View panel. And you are a pitiful, racist, no good B word. I cleaned that one up. Please, Jedediah is nothing shy of a Fox News bickering bubblehead. And we're back with the author of Do Not Disturb, How I Ghosted My Cell Phone to Take Back My Life. I took those from your book. You say you have a thick skin, Jedediah, but has Twitter become something of a sewer?
Yeah, I mean, I say I have a thick skin, but I also am human, and that was what I wanted to bring to people's attention, that it's really easy to say, oh, you should just ignore those crazy people. You know, they don't know you, they're just trolls, and that's true, but when it accumulates over time, it does get to you, and I pointed that out because I am not inclined to be affected by things like that. You know, I grew up in New York City, and I'm a pretty tough girl, I'm a Brooklyn girl, but I thought about kids when those things happened to me, and I thought about regular kids in school. I'm a former dean, I'm a former teacher.
Right.
Going on social media and facing that kind of cyberbullying and facing that kind of those personal attacks and how they would process that information. And I started to realize that this social media and the way this stuff has ballooned without us really thinking about the consequences can be very dangerous. And parents really need to have these conversations with their kids who are using Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram in particular.
Now, you did get many nice comments when you left the View. And by the way, was it hard for you? You have some stories about yourself in the book to be the only conservative/libertarian voice doing battle with Whoopi and Joy and the rest on The View?
I actually enjoyed that, and I did get a ton of people who, when I left the show, thanked me for bringing a different opinion to the table and who were really excited about the fact that I made them think about things in a way that they hadn't thought about them before. And many of them are still fans now and follow my work on Fox News, and I really appreciate that. I like being outnumbered. That's a position I'm used to. I worked in liberal academia for a long time. I live in liberal New York City, and most of my friends are liberal. So I feel like it's good. It challenges me, and, you know, I love those ladies at the table. And we can duke it out politically, but when the cameras go off, we would, head backstage and just chill. And that's the part that people don't know, right? Is that, you're all friends and you get off the set and you're like, hey, what are you having for dinner tonight?
Don't ruin the image. Now, you say in the book, everyone's life seems better on Instagram. You call it perception deception. But you weren't immune. I'm quoting here from your writing. At one point, I was doing a lot of squats in the gym, and I actually took photos that highlighted my butt.
Yes,
so you were caught up in this Instagram beautiful life thing as well.
Absolutely, and now I say the grass isn't greener, it just has a filter on it. That's something I had to learn, and I tell a lot of these embarrassing stories about mistakes I made. This is not a preachy book, this is not an I know better than you, this is I made myself look like an idiot a lot on social media because I thought I had to keep up with whoever was in this profession or whatever everyone else was doing, or if I'm not answering everyone or constantly present on social media, I'm going to be irrelevant. I took that advice from high-level people in the industry, and at some point realized, you know what, I'm not going to get rid of my social media. It is valuable in the industry, but I'm going to scale it back. I'm going to change the way I use it. I'm not going to comment on Facebook. I'm going to post and leave. I'm going to follow a lot less people on Instagram, and they're going to be people that I know and love and whose feeds I know are a reflection of their real life.
What a concept.
So little changes like that.
Speaking of embarrassing stories, you have about a minute. You talk about a boyfriend who was constantly on his BlackBerry years ago, and one day you looked at his phone and you discovered he was a big-time drug dealer, he had a lot of other women, and you dumped him. But my question is, was that because of the phone, or was it just the case of a bad boyfriend?
It was a bad boyfriend, and I say in the book that, I don't blame the phone. In other words, bad people are going to do bad things regardless of the technology. But I saw how easy it was to have a separate life in your phone and what could happen in the wrong hands. And I wanted to kind of alert people to that, the phone was no longer just there to make phone calls, and that technology sometimes can get away from us. And you know how it is, right? Sometimes you're interacting with someone face-to-face, and you realize there's an accountability to what you say and what you do. When you get into that phone space, sometimes you say things that you would never say in person in a way you would never say them in person.
This is all very fascinating, but I have to check my Twitter mentions.
Oh, great.
And we got to go. Jedediah Bila, thanks so much. I hope you'll come back.
Thank you.
After the break, the troubling mystery of a Saudi columnist who may have been murdered, and with some in the media actually blaming the Trump administration. That's next. The apparent murder of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi, a Washington Post opinion contributor, is a tragedy that sent shockwaves through the world journalism community. The Post reports that when Khashoggi entered the Saudi consulate in Turkey, a 15-member squad from Saudi Arabia, which had arrived on 2 private planes, was lying in wait for him, and that the plan, which might have been simply to kidnap Khashoggi and bring him home, was approved by the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman. Saudi government denies this, but Turkish officials have said they have video and audio evidence that he was killed inside the consulate in Istanbul. And we're back with Jillian Turner. Now, CNN contributor Mark Lamont Hill in Huffington Post. The Trump administration is complicit in Khashoggi's death. Others have said it in less inflammatory terms. But this is an autocratic government, perhaps in an apparent assassination, not people inflamed by Donald Trump's rhetoric.
No, but I will, and this is a horrific event. If he has in fact been murdered, no matter who is responsible for it ultimately. Sure. What I will say, though, is that criticizing the American president for being too cozy with Saudi Arabia early on during an administration is practically a national pastime for Americans. I mean, President Obama...
And not just for this president, yes.
That's what I'm saying. President Obama suffered the same criticism and then moved in a sort of 180 direction where he was barely on speaking terms with Saudi Arabia by the end of his tenure. President W. Bush was subjected to the same criticism for the entirety of his administration. This is not anything new.
Right. So when President Trump tells 60 Minutes in that interview airing tonight that there'll be severe punishment if Khashoggi was in fact killed, do you see him toughening his stance after several days, perhaps in response to media pressure?
The problem with his CBS interview, and we've only seen clips of it, is that it appears he hedges, right? He seems to say, they may very well be responsible for this, but they insist to me, so far, MBS insists that they are not. And it runs a little bit too close to the narrative he spun about President Putin. Well, look, I spoke to President Putin, and he promised me that he didn't interfere in our elections. You're not, when you're the American president, you're not supposed to take autocrats at their word.
Well, I take your point about previous U.S. administrations being overly cozy with Saudi Arabia, despite its horrible record on human rights, for example. But you have that, more than $100 billion in arms sales. And so it seems like this is not unique to this president, that the financial benefits, and not to mention some geopolitical benefits of being tight with Saudi Arabia, many presidents have chosen to kind of look the other way when it comes to the way the Saudis treat women. But still, an incident like this where somebody may well be dead seems to me to cross a new threshold.
It does and it doesn't. I mean, people have died at the hands of murderous regimes for years. In that sense,
but it doesn't get as much publicity because it's not somebody who's from the media world.
Perhaps. And perhaps the Saudis, if they are indeed complicit or guilty here, perhaps they misjudged that. Perhaps they thought that they could do this, and like many other journalists, it would never see the light of day. They misjudged.
New York Times had a front-page story after this blew up, saying that Jared Kushner had championed Mohammed bin Salman, known as MBS. So this is a personal reckoning for Jared, but many mainstream foreign policy writers also embraced him as a reformer. New York Times Magazine piece from just a few months ago, "The Prince Who Would Remake the World."
You can't sit something like this on the head of Jared Kushner. The reality is that Saudi Arabia is a complicated country. The U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia is vastly complicated. And to be honest, the media is not so good writ large at accepting the idea that there is a gray area, that two things can be true at once, two conflicting things. It is not an easy tightrope to walk for any administration. How to deal with a regime like this that promises to make reforms, that starts taking steps in that direction, but still has some dirty backwater to deal with.
There's a lot of context here. I'm particularly happy to have it from you since you worked on national security issues in 2 administrations. Jillian Turner, great to see you. I know you have some reporting to do. I'll let you run off. Still to come, a criminal indictment at Newsweek and a media indictment of White House official Stephen Miller for what he did in the 3rd grade. You might recall that some of Newsweek's top editors and reporters were fired and others quit while they were bravely digging into allegations involving their parent company. Now, Manhattan DA Cyrus Vance Jr. has charged parent company IBT Media and Christian Media and their bosses with creating a fake outfit to defraud lenders into providing millions of dollars, supposedly for computer services that were allegedly used to keep the magazine afloat. Now, IBT's co-founder denied the charges and said this was political retaliation by Vance. Sadly, it turns out the ousted Newsweek journalists were onto something big. Heads up, the following about a senior White House official is not an Onion headline. Stephen Miller's 3rd grade teacher. He was a loner and ate glue. That was in The Hollywood Reporter, a rant in which the teacher said Miller was a strange dude who would pour glue on his arm and, wait a minute, hold on. He was 8 years old. Why was this published? Does journalistic scrutiny now extend to everything we ever did in elementary school? The LA School District has now put teacher Nikki Fisk on paid leave. Finally, Axios reporter Jonathan Swan was on MSNBC's Hardball with liberal host Chris Matthews, who was going off on Mitch McConnell's strong-arm tactics on judicial nominees and didn't like it when Swan offered some nonpartisan balance.
Of course he's going to ram through someone in the last year of Trump's presidency and come up with a new justification. There's no. By the way, the Democrats will do exactly the same thing.
Okay, don't be this double thing, even-handed crap. Jonathan! Thank you, John, for the even-handed nonsense.
Well, I happen to like his even-handed nonsense, but then my job isn't to promote the Democrats every single night. That's it for this edition of Media Buzz. I'm Howard Kurtz. Hey, check out my new podcast, Media Buzz Meter. We kick around the day's 5 most important or fascinating stories, and you can subscribe at Apple iTunes, Google Play, FoxNewsPodcast.com. Some of the people you see on this show sometimes show up as guests. We hope you'll also check out our Facebook page. Give us a like. I post my daily columns there every day. Original video. We talk back and forth with you. And let's continue the conversation on Twitter. We were talking with Jedediah Bila about how Twitter can be, let's just say, very negative place. But I enjoy the constructive feedback, and the rest of you know who you are. At Howard Kurtz, love to hear from you. We're out of time. We'll be back here next Sunday, just like every Sunday, 11 Eastern. See you then with the latest buzz.